Jake Sullivan had seen plenty of strange things during his 3 years on Drakkar Prime, but nothing quite like this. The sun was setting behind the Crimson Mountains when he first heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost lost in the wind that constantly swept across the wasteland. But Jake had learned to trust his instincts out here. He stopped walking and listened harder. There it was again. A soft chirping noise, weak and desperate, coming from somewhere beyond the rocky outcrop to his left. He should have kept walking. Any sensible person would have. The Crimson Wastes weren't called that because of the pretty rocks. This was restricted territory, the kind of place where humans didn't belong. Where humans got themselves killed for being too curious. But that sound. It reminded him of the baby birds his sister Beth used to rescue back home on Earth. The ones that fell from their nests during storms. She'd stay up all night with them, feeding them with an eyedropper, keeping them warm. Jake smiled at the memory, then pushed forward toward the noise. What he found made his blood run cold. A small dragon hatchling was trapped in a mess of old metal cables, the kind left behind by illegal mining operations. The creature couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Its wing was caught at an awkward angle, and every time it struggled, the cables cut deeper into its scales. The chirping sounds it made were getting weaker. Jake's hands were shaking as he knelt down beside it. Every human on Drakkar Prime knew the law. Dragon law. It was simple and absolute. You don't touch Imperial offspring. Ever. The punishment was execution by fire, no trial, no questions asked. The dragons didn't believe in second chances when it came to their young. But looking at this tiny creature, bleeding and terrified, Jake couldn't think about the law. All he could think about was how scared it must be. How much pain it was in. "Easy there, little one," he whispered, keeping his voice soft and calm the way Beth used to. His fingers worked carefully at the cables, trying not to hurt the hatchling any more than it already was. The creature's eyes followed his movements, wide and confused but not aggressive. Just afraid. As Jake worked, he noticed something odd. The hatchling's scales weren't the normal gold or deep crimson he'd seen on other dragons. They shimmered with strange colors like oil on water, shifting between purple and blue and green. It was beautiful but wrong somehow. Different. And there was something else. Dragons were hot. Everyone knew that. They radiated heat like walking furnaces, even the babies. You could feel a dragon coming from 20 feet away just from the warmth they gave off. But this one felt almost cool to the touch. Not cold exactly, but nothing like the blazing temperature he expected. After what felt like forever, Jake finally freed the trapped wing. The hatchling stumbled, weak and shaking. Without thinking, Jake pulled off his jacket and wrapped the creature in it, holding it close to his chest. It was so small. So fragile. It looked up at him with those big, confused eyes, and Jake felt his heart break a little. He knew what he'd just done. He'd signed his own death warrant the moment he touched this creature. But as he stood there in the fading light, feeling the hatchling's rapid heartbeat against his chest, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. This was what made humans different, wasn't it? They couldn't just walk away from suffering, even when walking away was the smart choice. Even when it would save their lives. The walk back to his research outpost took an hour. The whole time, Jake talked quietly to the hatchling, nonsense mostly, just keeping his voice steady and calm. The creature seemed to respond to it, settling down a bit, its breathing becoming less panicked. His outpost was small, just 3 rooms built into the side of a cliff. It was home though, or as close to home as anywhere got out here. Jake went straight to his quarters and started gathering supplies. Medical scanner, thermal blankets, nutrient paste. He had no idea if any of this would work on a dragon, but he had to try something. He set up a makeshift nest in the corner using his spare blankets and carefully placed the hatchling inside. The creature curled up immediately, those strange prismatic scales catching the light. Jake ran the medical scanner over it, frowning at the readings. Low body temperature, irregular energy signature, no trace of the fire glands that should be developing by now. "You're different, aren't you?" Jake murmured, reaching out to gently stroke the hatchling's head. It made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and pressed into his touch. "Guess we'll call you Flicker. Even though you can't actually flicker yet." Jake spent the entire night monitoring Flicker's vital signs, making sure the little dragon was stable. He fed it small amounts of nutrient paste, which it ate slowly from his hand. Every few hours he'd check the wounds from the cables, keeping them clean. As dawn broke over the wasteland, Jake's communication system started beeping. His stomach dropped when he saw the alert. Imperial scouts had entered the sector. Multiple ships. Heavy class. They were looking for something. And Jake had a pretty good idea what that something was. The Dragon Emperor herself was coming. Emperor Ravenna had burned 17 outposts to ash in her search. Each one had been reduced to melted slag and scattered debris. She didn't care. Let them rebuild. Let them fear. She would tear apart every human settlement in this sector if that's what it took. Her youngest offspring, the one born without fire, had vanished during a ceremonial flight 3 weeks ago, and the rage that burned inside her was hotter than any flame she could breathe. The court had whispered behind her back. She'd heard every word. They called it a blessing, a mercy from the old gods. A defective hatchling lost to the winds. Better to have no child than one born weak and fireless. Some of her advisors had even suggested she stop the search, that she focus on her other offspring, the strong ones who could carry the imperial bloodline forward with honor. They didn't understand. They couldn't. Ravenna was an emperor, yes. She'd ruled for 3 centuries, conquered 12 star systems, and brought entire civilizations to their knees. But before all of that, before the crown and the power and the fear, she was a mother. And no mother, dragon or otherwise, stopped searching for their child. Her scouts had combed through debris fields and abandoned stations for weeks. They'd followed every lead, chased every rumor. Most had turned up nothing. But then, just as Ravenna was preparing to expand the search to the outer colonies, one of her best trackers picked up something interesting. A human research outpost in the Crimson Wastes. Normally, she wouldn't have given it a second thought. Humans were everywhere these days, studying this and cataloging that. Annoying but mostly harmless. But this outpost had unusual energy readings. Patterns that didn't match standard human equipment. Patterns that felt almost like dragon biosignatures but wrong somehow. Distorted. Ravenna didn't wait for more information. She went herself. The flight took less than an hour. As she approached the outpost, her massive wings casting shadows across the red desert below, she could see the tiny human settlement clinging to the cliff face. Pathetic really how small and fragile their structures were. One good burst of flame would turn the whole thing to powder. She landed with enough force to crack the ground beneath her claws. The impact sent tremors through the earth, and she heard alarms going off inside the human building. Good. Let them be afraid. Let them understand what was coming. Her wingspan was so broad that it blotted out the sun completely, plunging the outpost into shadow. Her scales, each one the size of a human hand, gleamed like molten platinum in the harsh desert light. Every movement she made radiated power, centuries of it, the kind of power that reminded everyone why dragons ruled and others obeyed. "Bring me the human," she commanded, her voice rolling across the wasteland like thunder. The Imperial guards that had followed her moved quickly, surrounding the outpost. They were dragonkin, smaller than true dragons but no less deadly. Each one carried plasma lances that could punch through reinforced steel. They took up positions at every exit, weapons ready. Inside the outpost, Jake heard the command. His hands were shaking as he picked up Flicker, holding the small dragon close to his chest. The hatchling chirped softly, nuzzling against him, completely unaware of the danger outside. Or maybe aware but not caring. Flicker had been with Jake for 3 days now, and in that time the little dragon had started to recover. The wounds from the cables had healed. The weakness was fading. But still no fire, no heat, nothing that marked it as a normal dragon. Jake walked into the central chamber, the largest room in his small outpost. It wasn't much, maybe 20 feet across, with workstations along the walls and a high ceiling. Within seconds, Imperial guards filed in behind him, their weapons trained on his back. He could feel the plasma lances humming with barely contained energy. One wrong move and they'd turn him into vapor. Then she entered. The temperature in the room jumped 20 degrees the instant Emperor Ravenna stepped through the doorway. Even though she'd shifted to a smaller form to fit inside the building, she was still massive. Her head nearly brushed the ceiling. Each breath she took heated the air until Jake felt sweat running down his back. But it was her eyes that really got him. Ancient eyes. Golden and merciless. Eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, that had witnessed things Jake couldn't even imagine. They fixed on him now, and specifically on what he was holding against his chest. "You dare touch what is mine?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it filled the entire room, resonated in Jake's bones, made his teeth ache. This was a voice that could shatter mountains, that could command armies, that had never been disobeyed. Jake swallowed hard. His throat was dry. Every instinct screamed at him to drop to his knees, to beg for mercy, to hand over the hatchling and pray she killed him quickly. But he thought about the past 3 days. About feeding Flicker by hand. About the way the little dragon had curled up next to him at night, seeking warmth and comfort. About those big, trusting eyes. "Your child was dying," Jake said, keeping his voice as steady as he could manage. "I helped." Ravenna's eyes narrowed. Smoke began to curl from her nostrils. My child is defective. Fireless. Weak. It should have perished. Something in Jake's chest tightened. Not fear this time but anger. He looked down at Flicker, at those strange, beautiful prismatic scales, and then back up at the Emperor. Your child, Jake said quietly but firmly, is extraordinary. Before Ravenna could respond, before the guards could fire, Jake gently placed Flicker on the ground. The hatchling stood there for a moment, looking confused. Then something amazing happened. Flicker's scales began to pulse with light, shifting through colors Jake had never seen before. The air around the hatchling started to shimmer. And suddenly, every piece of metal in the room started vibrating. Not shaking. Vibrating with a deep, resonant hum that Jake could feel in his chest. The plasma lances in the guard's hands began to twist, bending slightly despite being made of reinforced alloys. Data tablets floated up from the workstations, spinning slowly in the air. Steel beams in the walls groaned as electromagnetic waves rippled outward from Flicker in visible patterns, like heat waves but crackling with energy. Emperor Ravenna's eyes widened. In 300 years she had never seen anything like this. Impossible, she whispered. Jake spent the next hour explaining what he'd discovered, and with every word, Emperor Ravenna's expression shifted from rage to something he couldn't quite read. The first night I didn't know what to do, Jake admitted, kneeling down next to Flicker. The hatchling immediately pressed against his leg, those prismatic scales catching the light. I ran every scan I had. Medical, biological, thermal. Nothing made sense. No fire glands developing. Body temperature way below normal for dragons. I thought maybe Flicker was sick, dying even. He pulled up his data tablet, showing Ravenna the readings he'd collected. The Emperor leaned forward, her massive head tilting as she studied the information. But then I noticed something, Jake continued. Every time I got near electronic equipment, the readings spiked. At first I thought my scanner was broken. But it wasn't. Flicker was generating electromagnetic fields. Weak ones at first, but they were there. Ravenna's tail swished behind her, a sign Jake had learned meant she was thinking hard about something. Her guards stood frozen, unsure whether they should still be pointing their weapons or not. Electromagnetic manipulation isn't fire, Ravenna said slowly. It's not strength. Isn't it though? Jake asked. He gestured around the room at the metal beams still vibrating slightly from Flicker's earlier display. Fire burns things. That's all it does. But this can do so much more. Flicker can manipulate metal, generate protective shields, communicate through bioelectric signals. Your child didn't lose the ability to breathe fire. Flicker evolved beyond needing it. The Emperor was quiet for a long moment. Jake could see the conflict in her ancient eyes. Everything she knew, everything her culture had built itself on, said that fire was power. Fire was life. Dragons without fire were defective, worthless. But the evidence was right in front of her. How did you discover all this? Ravenna finally asked. Jake smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Flicker's eye ridge. The hatchling made a pleased trilling sound and leaned into his touch. I've been feeding Flicker by hand since that first night. Watch. He pulled out a small container of nutrient paste from his pocket. It was specially formulated stuff, meant for injured wildlife. Jake had modified it based on what he knew about dragon biology, adding extra proteins and minerals. He squeezed a small amount onto his palm and held it out. Flicker perked up immediately, moving to Jake's hand and eating the paste delicately. The hatchling's tongue was careful, making sure not to bite Jake's skin. When the paste was gone, Flicker looked up at him with those big eyes, clearly wanting more. Dragons don't do that, Ravenna said, and there was something strange in her voice. We don't hand-feed our young. I know, Jake said, giving Flicker another small portion. You teach through survival, right? Strength through hardship. The weak don't make it, and that's just how it is. But humans stopped doing that a long time ago. We figured out that caring for the weak, protecting them, helping them grow, that made us stronger as a species, not weaker. He demonstrated other things he'd learned. How Flicker would only settle down to sleep when pressed against Jake's chest, synchronizing breathing with him. How the hatchling responded to gentle touches and soft words, becoming calmer and more focused. How Flicker had learned to control the electromagnetic abilities better after Jake encouraged rather than punished mistakes. This is bonding, Ravenna said slowly, watching her offspring return to Jake's side again and again, curling against him like he was the most natural thing in the world. True bonding. Dragons do not bond like this. We dominate or we submit. We rule or we serve. There is no middle ground. Yeah, well, Jake said, and he couldn't help but smile a little despite the situation. Humans are kind of stubborn about that stuff. We don't really do the whole survival of the fittest thing anymore. We decided a long time ago that everyone deserves a chance. Even the ones who seem weak at first. He thought about his sister Beth back on Earth, about all those baby birds she'd saved. Most people would have said it was pointless, that nature should take its course. But Beth had believed every life mattered. And most of those birds had survived, had gone on to fly and thrive. Flicker wasn't dying because of some defect, Jake continued. Flicker was dying because nobody understood what was needed. Not fire, not heat, not the traditional dragon way. Just patience, care. Someone willing to see potential instead of failure. Ravenna's guards shifted nervously. The temperature in the room had been steadily dropping as the Emperor's rage faded, replaced by something none of them had ever witnessed before. Uncertainty. Doubt. Not in her power but in her beliefs. The Emperor moved closer, her massive form surprisingly gentle as she approached her offspring. Flicker looked up at her, chirped once, then pressed back against Jake's leg. Choosing comfort over blood. Choosing the one who'd shown kindness. That simple gesture seemed to affect Ravenna more than anything else. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was softer than anyone in that room had ever heard it. Softer than her guards thought possible from their ancient, powerful Emperor. You saved what I would have abandoned, she said quietly. Jake shrugged, still keeping one hand on Flicker's head. That's just what we do. Humans, I mean. We're not the strongest species out there. Not the fastest or the smartest. But we're really, really good at caring about things. Even when it doesn't make sense to. Even when it's dangerous. We can't help it. The Emperor stared at him for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, she lowered her massive head. Ravenna knelt. An Emperor. A ruler of 12 star systems. A creature who had lived for 3 centuries and never bowed to anyone. She knelt before a human. The guards gasped. One of them actually dropped his plasma lance, the weapon clattering against the floor with a sharp metallic sound. In all their years of service they had never seen anything like this. Emperors didn't kneel. They commanded. They conquered. They ruled from above, always above. But Ravenna lowered herself until her massive head was level with Flicker, and then she gently touched her snout to the hatchling's forehead. It was the softest gesture Jake had ever seen from a dragon. Tender. Careful. Like she was afraid she might hurt her own child. Flicker chirped happily at the touch, a bright, cheerful sound that filled the room. For a moment, the hatchling nuzzled against its mother's scales. Then, just as quickly, Flicker scampered back across the floor and jumped into Jake's arms, settling against his chest like that was home. Jake caught the little dragon instinctively, cradling Flicker the way he'd done 100 times over the past few days. He saw the look in Ravenna's eyes as she watched this happen, and his heart ached for her. There was pain there. Real deep pain. The kind a mother feels when her child chooses someone else's arms for comfort. The ancient dragon slowly straightened, and Jake could see understanding dawning in those golden eyes. Her child had chosen. Not because of power or dominance. Not because Jake was stronger or more capable. Flicker had chosen him because of trust. Because of something Ravenna was only now beginning to understand. Well, she looked at Jake for a long time, really looked at him. He was so fragile compared to her kind. This soft, scaleless mammal who couldn't breathe fire or fly. Who couldn't survive in the vacuum of space or withstand the heat of a star. A creature who would live maybe a century if he was incredibly lucky, barely a blink in dragon terms. Yet he possessed something her species had lost somewhere along the way. In their pursuit of power, in their obsession with strength and dominance, in their belief that only the strong deserved to survive, they had lost something fundamental. Gentleness. Ravenna's voice cracked when she finally spoke. She switched to Old Draconic, the ancient language of her ancestors, words so old that most modern dragons had forgotten them. Her fleet, listening through their communication systems, barely caught the words. We forgot how to be gentle. The admission hung in the air like smoke. The guards stood frozen, not knowing how to process what they were hearing. Their emperor, their immortal leader, was admitting to a flaw. To a mistake that had lasted centuries. Ravenna straightened fully now, and Jake could see the decision forming in her eyes. When she spoke again, it was in the common tongue, clear and firm, but with a softness that hadn't been there before. Jake Sullivan of Earth, she said, and the formal use of his full name made him stand a bit straighter. I request, not command, that you continue to care for my offspring. Jake's eyebrows shot up. Request, not command. Dragons didn't request things. They ordered. They demanded. They took what they wanted. Not as a servant, Ravenna continued, clearly struggling with the words. As. She paused, searching for a concept that didn't quite exist in dragon culture. As family. Jake blinked several times, sure he'd misheard. Wait. You're asking me to raise a dragon prince? I am asking you to teach us what we have forgotten, Ravenna said simply. My child thrives with you in ways I never achieved. You have knowledge we lost. Patience we abandoned. Compassion we deemed weakness. She looked down at Flicker, still nestled contentedly in Jake's arms. We were wrong. Those last 3 words seemed to cost her something. Jake could see it in the way her scales dimmed slightly, in the way her tail went still. Admitting fault wasn't easy for anyone, but for a dragon emperor, it must have been nearly impossible. Jake started then stopped. His mind was racing. I don't know the first thing about raising a dragon prince. I barely know how to take care of one small hatchling. The responsibilities, the politics, You know the only thing that matters, Ravenna interrupted. You know how to care. Within 3 days everything changed. The first visitor came at night, landing quietly outside Jake's outpost under cover of darkness. A lesser dragon noble named Thorn, his scales dull with shame, carrying a hatchling who was half the size it should be. The little dragon was so small it fit in Jake's 2 hands. They say you helped the Emperor's fireless one, Thorn said, his voice barely above a whisper. My daughter, she's too small. Won't grow. The physicians say to let nature take its course. His voice broke. Please. Jake took the tiny hatchling without hesitation. 2 days later, another dragon came. This one's hatchling couldn't sustain flight, its wings malformed and weak. Then another, whose child showed empathy for prey animals instead of the hunting instinct. Each parent came in secret, ashamed to admit their offspring were defective, but desperate enough to try anything. Word spread quietly through the dragon community. There was a human in the Crimson Waste who didn't see failure, who saw potential, who had done the impossible and made the Emperor's rejected child thrive. Jake's small outpost transformed. He converted the storage rooms into nurseries, set up monitoring equipment for each hatchling, developed different care routines for different needs. The tiny one needed constant feeding. The flight-challenged one needed physical therapy exercises. The empathetic one needed emotional support and patience. It was exhausting. Jake barely slept. But every time he looked at these small dragons, healthy and growing despite what everyone had predicted, he knew this was important. Maybe the most important thing he'd ever done. His outpost had become something unprecedented in dragon history. A place where the broken weren't discarded. Where weakness wasn't punished. Where every life was given a chance to prove what it could become. A place where the forgotten were made whole. 20 years later, Jake stood on the ceremonial platform, and for the first time in a long while he felt old. His hair had gone gray at the temples. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, etched by 2 decades of late nights and early mornings. His back ached a bit when he stood too long, a reminder that human bodies weren't built to last forever. But as he looked out over the gathered crowd of dragons and humans below, Jake couldn't help but smile. This was worth every sleepless night. Every moment of doubt. Every time he'd wondered if what he was doing actually mattered. Beside him, Emperor Ravenna stood in her full imperial form, massive and magnificent. But there was something different about her now compared to that day 20 years ago when she'd crashed into his life. The hardness in her eyes had softened. The rigid set of her shoulders had relaxed. She looked, Jake thought, like someone who'd finally learned to breathe after holding their breath for centuries. They're coming, Ravenna said softly, her gaze fixed on the sky. Jake shielded his eyes against the sun and looked up. Even after all these years, the sight still took his breath away. Flicker descended first, as was proper for the eldest. But the little hatchling Jake had rescued wasn't so little anymore. Flicker was massive now, easily one of the largest dragons in the Imperium, with those distinctive prismatic scales that had once marked him as defective now recognized as a sign of something revolutionary. The electromagnetic fields that surrounded him were so strong Jake could feel them from the platform, making the hair on his arms stand up. Flicker's abilities had revolutionized space travel. Those electromagnetic fields could generate protective shields around ships, navigate through cosmic radiation that would fry normal navigation systems, and even create stable wormholes for faster-than-light travel. The fireless dragon had opened up entire sections of the galaxy that had been unreachable before. Behind Flicker came the others, and Jake's chest swelled with pride. There was Kyle's dragon, the one who'd been too small all those years ago. She'd never gotten big by dragon standards, remaining compact and lean. But she'd developed the ability to manipulate gravitational fields, making her the fastest dragon alive. She could dive into the heart of a star and come out unscathed, riding gravity waves like a surfer on water. Laura's dragon followed, the one who couldn't sustain flight and whose wings had seemed useless. Through years of physical therapy and encouragement, those wings had developed differently, becoming tuned to generate healing frequencies. She could repair damaged tissue, cure diseases, even mend broken bones with the sound waves her wing beats created. Dragon hospitals now existed because of her. Then came Grace's dragon, soaring with quiet confidence. The empathetic one, the dragon who'd shown compassion for prey instead of the hunting instinct. That empathy had manifested as an ability to sense emotional distress across vast distances, making her invaluable for search and rescue operations. She'd saved thousands of lives, both dragon and otherwise. And Travis's dragon, the one everyone had thought was dying because it seemed to flicker in and out of existence. Turned out the hatchling could phase through matter, existing partially in another dimension. That ability had unlocked new understanding of quantum physics and dimensional travel that scientists were still trying to fully comprehend. The peculiar dragons. The defective ones. The mistakes. They had become the Imperium's greatest asset, each one contributing something that traditional dragons never could have imagined. They landed one by one on the platform and the crowd below erupted in cheers. Not just dragons anymore but humans too, and other species who joined what was becoming less of an empire and more of a community. "You changed everything," Ravenna said quietly, her voice almost lost in the celebration. "One human with a stubborn heart." Jake smiled, feeling the weight of those years but also the lightness of seeing something beautiful come from them. "I just treated a scared kid with kindness. You guys did the hard part, learning that strength and compassion aren't opposites. That they can exist together. That they should exist together." The Dragon Imperium had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. Hatchlings were nurtured now, given time and space to develop at their own pace. Bonds were formed instead of dominance being established through force. The ancient ways hadn't been abandoned completely, dragons were still dragons after all, strong and fierce and proud. But those ways had been tempered with something humans had always understood. Love didn't make you weaker. It made you stronger. Flicker approached Jake, lowering his massive head. Despite his size, despite his power, despite being recognized as a prince and a revolutionary, Flicker still wanted the same thing he'd wanted as a frightened hatchling in the Crimson Wastes. Jake reached up and scratched behind Flicker's eye ridge, that spot that had always been his favorite, and the great dragon rumbled contentedly. The sound was like thunder purring, deep and resonant and full of peace. Ravenna placed a claw gently on Jake's shoulder, careful not to hurt him. The gesture was tender, protective, grateful. "Thank you," she said, "for showing us that the strongest thing in the universe isn't the ability to destroy. It's the courage to nurture what others would discard. The wisdom to see potential in what others call broken. The love to care when caring is difficult." Jake watched the peculiar dragons together, this new generation that bridged the gap between human heart and dragon might. They represented something unprecedented, a future built not on dominance but on understanding. Not on survival of the fittest, but on giving everyone a chance to find their own kind of strength. "Anytime," Jake said, and he meant it. "That's just the human way."